Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corin. So we've had some really great episodes about everything related to military, you name it, whether we're talking about military colleges or tactics or how decoys work in today's world. And I had a great friend growing up who was what you might call a military anorak. Those who didn't grow up in the British Isles or in Ireland mightn't be familiar with the term anorak. It's kind of I would say, someone who's really into something like, train spotters, those kind of folk. But I feel like it's not as pejorative. It doesn't carry that kind of negative connotation as some of the other words one might use, like boffin. But we should do maybe an episode at one point about how loaded language is, how connotations differ across cultures. You see, I just never stop thinking of prompt ideas, unfortunately, because I do actually do other things in my life than send in prompts and listen to your episodes, like putting together monitor screens. Herman and Corin, I would like to chat today about the one of these acronyms we keep hearing about lately, and that is CENTCOM. So as usual, I did some pre-research on ChatGPT, and it says that CENTCOM is a Unified Combatant Command, or CCMD. Let's just ignore the fact for the moment that the acronym and the spelled out words actually don't make sense, but moving on. There's 7 geographic CCMDs and 4 functional ones. Functional ones are SOCOM, STRATCOM, Transcom, and Cybercom. The geographic ones are AFRICOM. Well, okay, I'm going to exclude space because we've talked ad nauseum or a lot about outer space, and let's focus just on the boring, unglamorous part of the atmosphere that we inhabit in our daily lives today. AFRICOM, CENTCOM, EUCOM. Oh, here's a horrible acronym. Indo-PACOM. Say that very quickly 3 times. Indo-PACOM. Indo-PACOM, NORTHCOM, and SOUTHCOM. So 6, basically, excluding space. And the US is the world's largest army by most measures, with SIPRI estimating US military expenditure for 2024 to be about $997 billion. So just shy of $1 trillion. And China, by comparison, $314 billion. So it's not just the US military is huge, it's colossal. During one of the flights to the US, I went on a binge of Wayland Productions. I might have just botched that YouTube channel, and I'm sorry that my notes didn't extend that far. One of these factual YouTube channels, and it was talking about the logistics of the US military that are just crazy. The US military literally has its own internal airline, transporting troops and people between air bases, and it does something that I thought was genius. It has warehouses. We know that the US has a bunch of overseas military bases, including here in Israel. But beyond that, it has warehouses with munitions and all the stuff needed for war forward deployed, so that if war breaks out somewhere, they don't have to just fill up a bunch of C-17s. The parts are literally just sitting ready for use in different theaters of war, which I thought was pretty cool, I have to be honest. So what I'd love to chat about, Herman and Corin, is these 6 major commands. I assumed that Israel was always in CENTCOM, or under the AOR, and that's the final acronym that I have time for today. An AOR is an area of responsibility, so the geographical region that the CCMD covers. And that wasn't the case previously. Israel was shifted. My question, however, is for this episode is these discrete. If we have something as huge as the US military in a global operation, we have to divvy it up the command chain. We talked about C2 the other day, command and control. And I can only imagine that these 6 areas of responsibilities, they're clearly not their own military, but they must have a significant amount of autonomy and operations within their AOR, going up the chain of command. As in, even if we think about AFRICOM, Africa is a gigantic place. So I can imagine that the command structure there is pretty big. So my questions, Herman and Corin, when you have a globally distributed chain of command like this, what in practice do these different organizations or subunits of the military have? I mean, when I say autonomy, I mean, to what extent do they decide their operations in their AOR versus what comes from the really top brass? And the assets that the US has, right? We talk about the Gerald Ford warship, which is moving currently in deployment to the Middle East. And, the US military has so many assets ranging from Navy teams to Navy SEAL teams, if we think about one globally mobile unit. And my question is, within that AOR, you have resources that are maybe permanently there. But what happens when you have mobile teams that get deployed in different parts of the world under a different AOR? Do they suddenly kind of find themselves talking to commanders they've never encountered or met before? Or how does that work in practice, this delineation? Herman and Corin, let's talk about how the global superpower that is US military is actually spread out over the globe with these different areas of responsibilities and commands in today's episode of My Word Prompts.
You know, Herman, we were sitting out on the balcony last night looking over the city, and I was thinking about how small the world feels sometimes. But then I started reading into the sheer geography of how the United States military organizes itself, and suddenly, the world feels massive again. It is one thing to know there are bases everywhere, but it is another to understand the actual lines drawn across the globe.
Herman Poppleberry, at your service, Corn. And yeah, you are touching on one of the most complex organizational charts ever devised by humans. It is essentially the ultimate management challenge. How do you take a force of millions, with assets ranging from satellites to submarines, and make sure everyone knows who they are reporting to at 3 in the morning in a time zone halfway across the planet? Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that, the combatant commands and the areas of responsibility.
It is a great prompt because it hits on that intersection of geography, politics, and raw logistics. Daniel wants to know how this globally distributed chain of command actually works in practice. We are talking about 7 geographic commands and 4 functional ones, and I think the most interesting part of his question is about autonomy. To what extent do these commanders out in the field actually run their own show versus just waiting for a call from the Pentagon?
That is the $1,000,000 question, or I guess in this case, the $1,000,000,000 question given the budget we are looking at. Just for context, the United States military expenditure for 2024 was estimated at around $997 billion. To manage that kind of investment, you cannot have a single person in Washington, D.C. micromanaging every single patrol boat. So, the system they have built is this fascinating hybrid of absolute top-down authority and significant regional autonomy.
Right, so let's set the stage. Most people have probably heard names like CENTCOM or AFRICOM in the news, but they might not realize these are not just names for groups of soldiers, they are actual geographic zones. If you are a soldier in Germany, you are in EUCOM, European Command. If you are in Japan, you are in Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command. It is like the world is divided into these giant corporate districts, but the product is security and power projection.
Exactly. And the history of how we got here is actually pretty vital. It really goes back to the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. Before that, the different branches, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, they did not play well together. They had their own chains of command, their own budgets, and they often bumped heads in the field. Goldwater-Nichols changed the game by making the combatant commanders, the 4-star generals and admirals in charge of these regions, incredibly powerful. They report directly to the Secretary of Defense and the President. The heads of the Army or Navy, they do not actually command troops in the field anymore. They just organize, train, and equip them.
Wait, that is a huge distinction that I think most people miss. So, the Chief of Staff of the Army does not actually tell an Army unit in Kuwait what to do.
Exactly. He provides the soldiers, he makes sure they have the right boots and the right tanks, but once they are deployed into the central command area of responsibility, they belong to the commander of CENTCOM. That separation of powers is designed to ensure that the person fighting the war has everything they need from all the services, unified under one vision.
That makes sense. It avoids that too many cooks in the kitchen problem. But let's look at the map itself. Indo-Pacific is the big one, right? It covers more of the Earth's surface than any other command.
It is staggering. Indo-Pacific Command covers about half the Earth's surface. We are talking from the west coast of the United States all the way to the border of India. It includes 36 nations and more than half the world's population. When you are the commander of Indo-Pacific, you are essentially the primary U.S. diplomat and military leader for half the planet. That is where the autonomy comes in. You are dealing with China, North Korea, Australia, and India. You have to have the leeway to make decisions based on the ground reality.
And then you have CENTCOM, which we hear about constantly here in Jerusalem. Central Command covers the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of South Asia. It is interesting because Israel actually moved from EUCOM to CENTCOM just a few years ago, in 2021.
That was a massive shift. For decades, Israel was under European command because of the political tensions with its neighbors. The U.S. did not want to force Arab nations to coordinate with a command that also included Israel. But with the Abraham Accords and changing regional dynamics, it finally made sense to put Israel in the same room, so to speak, as the neighbors it was increasingly cooperating with. It shows that these lines on the map are not just about military logistics, they are deeply political.
So, let's get into the how of it. Daniel asked about the command lineage when things move. This is where it gets really trippy. Let's take the USS Gerald Ford, the aircraft carrier. It is based in Norfolk, Virginia, which is NORTHCOM, Northern Command, or technically under the Atlantic Fleet, but then it sails across the ocean to the Mediterranean. Now it is in EUCOM. If it goes through the Suez Canal, it enters CENTCOM. Does the captain of that ship just get a new boss the moment they cross an invisible line in the water?
Effectively, yes, but the military has a very specific language for this to keep it from being chaotic. They use terms like OPCON and TACON. OPCON is operational control, and TACON is tactical control. When that carrier moves from one region to another, the ownership of the mission shifts. The admiral in charge of EUCOM might have OPCON, meaning he decides the broad mission of the ship while it is in his waters. But if that ship is just passing through to get somewhere else, he might only have TACON, which is more about local coordination and safety.
That sounds like a nightmare for the crew. Imagine your boss changing 3 times in a month. Do they actually know these people? Daniel asked if they report to commanders they have never worked with before.
Often, yes. But remember, the U.S. military is obsessed with standardized procedures. A Navy captain knows exactly how a CENTCOM briefing is going to look because it is the same format as a EUCOM briefing. The language of command is universal. And while the top commander might be new to them, the staff officers, the people doing the day-to-day coordination, they are constantly talking across those boundaries. There is a handoff process that is as rehearsed as a relay race.
It still feels like there would be friction. If I am the commander of EUCOM and I have this massive billion-dollar asset like the Gerald Ford in my backyard, I probably do not want to let it go. Is there a tug-of-war for resources between these commands?
Oh, absolutely. That is one of the biggest hidden dramas in the Pentagon. Every combatant commander thinks their region is the most important. The commander of AFRICOM is constantly arguing that he needs more surveillance drones to track extremist groups in the Sahel. The commander of Indo-Pacific is arguing he needs those same drones to monitor the South China Sea. This is where the functional commands come in, the ones Daniel mentioned like Transcom and Stratcom.
Right, let's talk about those. Functional commands do not have a spot on the map. They have a job that spans the whole world. Transcom, Transportation Command, is basically the world's biggest shipping and logistics company.
It really is. If you need to move 10,000 troops and their tanks from Georgia to Poland, you do not call the commander of EUCOM and ask him to come pick you up. You call Transcom. They own the planes, the cargo ships, and the refueling tankers. They are the service provider for all the geographic commands. It is a brilliant system because it centralizes the expensive stuff. You do not give every region its own fleet of C-17 transport planes. You keep them in a central pool managed by Transcom, and they distribute them based on priority.
And then you have SOCOM, Special Operations Command. This one is interesting because Navy SEALs or Army Green Berets are technically SOCOM assets, but they are almost always working inside someone else's geographic area. How does that work? Does a SEAL team in Somalia report to the SOCOM commander in Florida, or the AFRICOM commander in Germany?
That is where it gets really nuanced. Usually they are chopped. That is the military term. They are chopped to the geographic command. So, the SEALs in Somalia are under the operational control of the commander of AFRICOM. However, SOCOM back in Florida still handles their specialized training, their unique gear, and their long-term career management. It is a matrix organization. You have a functional boss who makes sure you are a great SEAL, and a geographic boss who tells you which door to kick down today.
It sounds like a lot of paperwork, but I can see why it is necessary to prevent these subunits from becoming private armies. But what about the autonomy part? If the commander of CENTCOM decides he needs to launch a strike against a specific target, does he need to call the president? Or can he just pull the trigger?
It depends on the rules of engagement and the political sensitivity of the target. For routine operations, like intercepting a suspect vessel in the Gulf, the combatant commander has a huge amount of autonomy. He is a 4-star officer for a reason. He is expected to handle his business. But for anything that could start a war or has major diplomatic fallout, there are trigger points where he has to go up the chain to the Secretary of Defense.
I imagine that in the age of instant communication, the temptation for the top brass in Washington to micromanage must be huge. Back in the day, a commander in the Pacific was weeks away by mail. Now, the president can see a live drone feed of what a sergeant is doing in a village in Afghanistan.
That is a phenomenon often called the long screwdriver. It is a major point of tension. You have these brilliant regional commanders who feel like they are being second-guessed by people in a basement in D.C. who have never been to the region. But on the flip side, in a world of nuclear weapons and 24-hour news cycles, a mistake by a single corporal can have global consequences. So the leash is a lot shorter than it used to be.
Let's talk about the newer commands, SpaceCom and CyberCom. These feel like they break the whole geographic model. I mean, where is the border of space? Or the border of the internet?
SpaceCom is fascinating because its area of responsibility starts at 100 kilometers above sea level and goes up forever. It is the only geographic command that is not on Earth, and you are right, it overlaps with every other command. If an Indo-Pacific commander needs satellite imagery to track a fleet, he is technically using a SpaceCom asset. It requires a level of jointness that is still being ironed out.
And CyberCom? That feels like it should be functional, but it acts almost like a geographic command in the digital realm.
Exactly. CyberCom was elevated to a full unified combatant command in 2018. Their job is to defend the Department of Defense's own networks, but also to conduct offensive operations. The Internet does not care about the borders of CENTCOM or EUCOM, so CyberCom has to coordinate with everyone. If a hacker in Russia is attacking a power grid in the US, that is a NORTHCOM problem geographically, but a CyberCom problem technically.
It is amazing how much of this is about defining boundaries that do not actually exist in nature. We have drawn these lines in the sand, in the air, and in the bits of the internet. But let's look at the mobile assets Daniel mentioned again. The SEAL teams. He asked if they report to commanders they have never worked with. If a SEAL team is moved from a mission in SOUTHCOM, South America, to a mission in AFRICOM, do they feel like they are starting a new job?
In some ways, yes. The local vibe is different. The theater requirements are different. In SOUTHCOM, they might be focused on counter-narcotics and working with local police. In AFRICOM, they might be focused on high-intensity counter-terrorism against Al-Shabaab. The mission changes, the local allies change, and the boss has a different set of priorities. But the SEALs themselves, they are the constant. They bring their own internal culture and expertise. They are like a specialized surgical team that gets flown from one hospital to another. They know how to do the surgery, they just need the local hospital to provide the lights in the operating room.
That is a good analogy. So the geographic command is the hospital, providing the infrastructure, the local knowledge, and the overall admissions policy, and the functional command provides the surgeons.
Exactly. And the hospital administrator, the geographic commander, has to make sure all these different specialists, the pilots from the Air Force, the sailors from the Navy, the surgeons from SOCOM, all work together without killing the patient. It is a massive exercise in deconfliction.
Deconfliction. That is a very military word. I guess it basically means making sure we do not accidentally shoot each other or get in each other's way.
Precisely. Think about the crowded airspace over a place like Syria a few years ago. You had U.S. Air Force jets, Navy jets from a carrier, drones from the CIA, special operations helicopters, and then all the international allies. Without a single unified command structure like CENTCOM to deconflict that space, you would have had mid-air collisions every single day. The Combatant Command is the ultimate air traffic controller for the entire spectrum of war.
So, what happens when there is a seam? Like, the border between two commands. If a pirate ship is being chased by the US Navy, and it crosses from the AFRICOM area into the CENTCOM area, does the Navy have to stop and wait for permission?
In theory, there is a handoff. In practice, they have pursuit authorities that allow them to cross those seams, but they have to notify the other command immediately. Those seams are actually where adversaries try to operate. If you know that two commands do not communicate well, you try to hang out right on the border. It is like a criminal committing a crime on the county line, hoping the two sheriffs will argue over who has jurisdiction. The U.S. military is very aware of this, so they hold constant seam exercises to make sure the handoff is seamless.
It is funny to think about a four-star general being annoyed that a pirate crossed into his yard without a phone call. But I guess when you are at that level, the ego and the responsibility are inseparable. Herman, what about the scale of the forward deployed resources Daniel mentioned, like the warehouses full of munitions? I saw a video about this once, how the US has entire pre-positioned sets of equipment just sitting in places like Kuwait or Norway.
Oh, the pre-positioned stocks are a logistical marvel. They call them APS, Army Pre-Positioned Stocks. The idea is that moving a heavy brigade of tanks across the ocean takes weeks. But if you already have the tanks sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse in, say, Qatar, you just have to fly the soldiers in on a passenger plane. They land, they drive to the warehouse, they turn the keys, and they are ready to fight in 48 hours.
That is incredible. So the command structure has to manage not just the people, but these ghost armies of equipment that are just waiting for a signal.
Right. And the geographic commander is responsible for the security of those stocks. He has to make sure the host nation, the country where the warehouse is located, is happy and that the equipment is maintained. It is a huge part of the deterrence mission. If an adversary sees that you have 1,000 tanks sitting an hour away from their border, they think twice before making a move.
It really feels like the US military is less like a traditional army and more like a global infrastructure project. It is about maintaining the plumbing of power so that it can be turned on anywhere, instantly.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the combatant commands are the regional managers of that plumbing. They are the ones who know where the leaks are, who know the local landlords, and who have the tools to fix things before they get out of hand. It is why, even though the US has been pivoting to Asia for years, they cannot just shut down CENTCOM or EUCOM. The infrastructure is too deep.
So, to Daniel's point about autonomy, it sounds like these commanders are almost like modern-day Roman proconsuls. They have their own provinces, their own budgets, their own diplomatic relations, and as long as they do not embarrass the emperor, they have a pretty long leash.
The proconsul analogy is actually used quite often in academic circles. A commander like the head of Indo-Pacific has more influence in the Pacific than almost any civilian diplomat. When he shows up in a country, he brings the promise of security, training, and billions of dollars in potential cooperation. That is a lot of soft power, backed by very hard assets.
But does that ever create conflict with the State Department? You have an ambassador in a country who is supposed to be the top US official, and then this four-star general flies in with a carrier strike group. Who is actually in charge?
That is a classic interagency tension. Technically, the ambassador is the chief of mission and is in charge of everything in that specific country. But the combatant commander is in charge of the region. So if the general wants to do a joint exercise with the local military and the ambassador thinks it will upset the local political situation, they have to hash it out. Usually, it works, but there have been famous cases where the military and the diplomats were singing from completely different songbooks.
It feels like the jointness we keep talking about, the idea of everyone working together, is the only thing keeping this whole thing from collapsing under its own weight. If you did not have a clear chain of command from the president to the combatant commander, you would just have chaos.
And that is exactly why the structure exists. It is a response to the chaos of the past. If you look at the failed rescue attempt of the U.S. hostages in Iran in 1980, Operation Eagle Claw, it was a disaster partly because the different services could not coordinate. They had different radios, different procedures, and no single commander with the authority to make the call. The Combatant Command system is the never-again solution to that failure.
So, looking ahead, do you think we will see more commands? We just got SpaceCom a few years ago. Is there going to be an Arctic command as the ice melts and that region becomes a conflict zone?
There is a lot of talk about that. Currently, the Arctic is split between NORTHCOM, EUCOM, and Indo-Pacific. It is a seam nightmare. As shipping lanes open up and Russia and China increase their presence there, the pressure to create a NORDCOM or something similar is growing. The map is never truly finished. It evolves with the climate, with technology, and with the threats.
It is fascinating. You start with a question about who reports to whom, and you end up with a map of the future of the planet. Herman, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, literally and figuratively.
We really have. From the deep-sea cables that Cybercom protects to the satellite Spacecom manages, it is all one giant interconnected web, and the spider at the center of each part of that web is a combatant commander.
Well, I feel a lot more informed, and maybe a little more intimidated by the scale of it all. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It really pushed us to look at the bones of how global power is actually organized.
Definitely. It is easy to look at the muscles, the ships and planes, but the bones are the command structure that makes those muscles move in the right direction. Before we wrap up, I just want to say to our listeners, if you are finding these deep dives into the weird mechanics of our world interesting, please leave us a review on your podcast app. It really does help other curious minds find the show.
Yeah, we love seeing the community grow. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, all 776 of them, at myweirdprompts.com. We have got an RSS feed there for the subscribers and a contact form if you want to send us your own weird ideas.
You can also reach us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you get your audio fix.
Thanks for joining us in Jerusalem today. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, stay curious. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.